I'm Kristen McMahon, the president of the Robert H. Jackson Center in Jamestown, New York. Today's tea with Raymond C. Pierce of the Southern Education Foundation was recorded on Thursday, June 10th to accommodate his travel schedule. However, with us in the chat live today will be Kenita Williams, the Chief of Staff and Director of Leadership Development for the Southern Education Foundation. We hope you enjoyed today's tea and look forward to your questions. Welcome to Tea Time with the Jackson Center. My name is Kristen McMahon, and I have the pleasure of serving as the president of the Robert H. Jackson Center in Jamestown, New York. We envision a world where the universal principles of equality, fairness, and justice prevail. 2021 is an important recognition year for Justice Jackson, for international humanitarian law, and the Jackson Center itself. And during the course of this year, we will be celebrating the 80th anniversary of Justice Jackson's appointment to the Supreme Court, the completion of the 75th anniversary of the Nuremberg trials, and the birth of international humanitarian law, and the 20th anniversary of the Jackson Center itself. All of those milestones and our planning to commemorate or celebrate them had us looking to the past to see how far we, the law, and the world have come. But we know we cannot simply rest on our laurels. And so it also sparked conversations regarding where we are headed and how we get there. And that's part of the story of how we got to our theme for 2021, the work left to do. During this year, we are convening conversations about democracy, US and global institutions, human rights, and equity. We have structured our bi-monthly teas a little bit differently this year. Each month has a particular focus, and in June, we are looking at education justice and equity gaps in education. The first tea each month is geared to provide you with an understanding of the work left to do to achieve equity or to make progress in this area. And the second tea each month, which this is geared to showcase those actively doing the work to close the gaps. And in this case, actually, we have a little bit of both in this tea. So we hope each of these programs inspires you to have conversations with your family, friends, and colleagues, and to seek out ways to make change in your own communities. So today, I'm excited to be in conversation with Raymond Pierce, the Executive Director of the Southern Education Foundation, which is committed to advancing equitable education policies and practices that elevate learning for low-income students and students of color in the Southern states. They develop and disseminate research-based solutions for policymakers and grow the capacity of education leaders and influencers to create systemic change. They were founded in 1867 and believe education equity is essential to achieve quality and fairness in the public education system. Raymond, thank you so much for joining me for tea today.
Thank you, Kristen. Thank you for having me.
And thank you for bearing with that long intro.
Okay.
So I like to start each of these teas with a foundational question. And so obviously for our month on education, I want to start with, when we're talking about equity in education, what do we mean by that? What is your view on that?
Well, my view and the position of the Southern Education Foundation, and like so many others in the education and equity space, defines equity in education as is educating a child by considering all the needs of the child. Not all children and all populations of children have the same foundations for learning. There are a lot of inequities just are baked into our systems, so that some students are starting school already behind. Some students are in school and do not have the support structures to get them over a next leap for more learning, for more deeper learning. Some students, come from homes that are buffeted about or somewhat disrupted by the challenges of life that oftentimes will not allow a parent or a guardian to assist the child in his or her homework, like other populations of students might be able to have. So there are a lot of things that that make where the student starts not fair. And so you don't want to hold anybody back who is blessed or fortunate to have these foundations, but you want to make sure those students who do have some deprivations, that do not have certain resources or do not have certain foundations, that they can be accommodated in the learning setting. It's not a complicated thing. It's not a new idea. It's just scaling that up and recognizing that, if this country is going to remain, strong and with a viable, educated, and well-trained population, we got to make sure that our major system for doing that, public education, accounts for all the nuances of our students who come to us as best as can practically be accomplished.
Okay, that makes sense. I've heard it, and in my research for our conversation, some people view the lens as an opportunity gap. Some people view the lens as an achievement gap. And obviously those are very different. What you were just describing sounds to me more on the opportunity gap
Yes.
side of things. So I wanted to
Yes.
see which lens you tend to view things through.
Yes. I look at the opportunity. You can address achievement later. I'm not going to try to address achievement. Why is my son not achieving well if I know my son has certain foundational deficiencies that many of his or her his classmates do not.
That makes sense. And does this conversation change when we move beyond the K through 12 discussion, when we move into post-secondary or even postgraduate level?
To some degree, it changes, but in some ways it doesn't. Because even when we get up to post-secondary education, you still have situations where young people are arriving at college their first year with huge deficiencies in terms of their preparation, because they're coming from systems that, again, have been hampered by inequities, hampered by political disruptions, hampered by so many things that some of these students come, particularly in some of your large school districts, are coming into college without the best preparation for collegiate level work. And that's actually something that higher education can address in collaboration with secondary education.
That makes perfect sense. And because we have been living through 2020, I feel like I have to ask this question because there were a lot of news stories about how COVID really revealed some of the gaps and inequities in our education system. How has COVID changed the conversation?
COVID has changed the conversation by precisely what you just said, and that is by highlighting, and I wouldn't say unveiling, but highlighting, lifting up, reminding people that there are some inequities in societal constructs that result in differentiations as to how children will learn in a pandemic when schools are shut down and education is diverted into remote learning. When I served in the federal government's Department of Education back in the 90s, mid to late 90s, that's the first time I ever heard of the digital divide, as the internet was becoming more and more in use and teachers were actually incorporating technology into the classroom. We quickly learned that not all populations have that. Some students live in communities where there is no internet. Some students live in communities where most don't have a computer at home. Most live in there. You have a lot of students live in areas, even if they have an internet and they can get to a computer, they don't have, they can't pay for the service, the internet service. So there's just a number of and deficiencies and inadequacies that were highlighted during the COVID-19 that the Southern Education Foundation and others early on took hold of to develop guidelines for educators and administrators to accommodate for those deficiencies. So yes, the pandemic, it highlighted, for some people revealed that we still have some really major disparities throughout the country that can disrupt equity in education opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely. Last year, as part of our 2020 programming, we spoke with Joshua Edmonds, who is in Detroit. And to my knowledge, the only person at the municipal level who is working on a specific title dedicated to working on solving the digital divide challenge. And so for a lot of our listeners and watchers, we live in fairly urban areas. We anticipate, because most of us are very well connected, that that's how it functions for everybody. And I think that both this conversation and our earlier conversation with Joshua really just, as you said, highlighted the fact that that playing field is not at all equitable.
Kristen, I was in a conversation yesterday, I forget with whom, and large percentages of students, particularly students of color, and larger percentages in the southern states, but lots of students throughout the country at home during the pandemic, trying to watch their teacher instructor, conduct the lesson on her cell phone. They were using their cell phone, not a laptop, definitely not a desktop. The child has a cell phone, is trying to, I've seen someone try to do that, an adult try to do that once, follow a remote business meeting from cell phone. That's different, Can you imagine trying to learn? Yes. So yeah, there's some
hours
problems.
each day to be tuned in that way. Yes, absolutely.
Yes.
So for some of our listeners, I feel as if this conversation about education equity or equity gaps in education is going to feel new-ish. Probably their thinking is it goes back to Brown, and that sort of Brown was the kickoff of this conversation. Obviously, your organization has been around since shortly after the Civil War. So this is a much longer conversation.
Yes.
And I think many people would naturally intuit. And so I'd love to learn a little bit about the history of the Southern Education Foundation, if you wouldn't mind walking us just through some of the highlights of that.
Well, sure, Kristen. And it helps to know that the Southern Education Foundation emerged from a large volume of philanthropy in the country, particularly coming out the Northeast, that evolved in the early days after the Civil War. Some of it even just before the Civil War even ended, in terms of funding the abolitionist movement, the movement to abolish slavery in the nation. But there was a tremendous amount of philanthropy, people of wealth who had made big wealth, and the number one issue for them was the barbaric nature of enslaving people. One, but then when the war ended, and the Civil War was, the South was pretty much destroyed, and Reconstruction began, and so much of a focus, understandably, was on the infrastructure that had been destroyed during this war. Railroads, fields, crops, ports. It was war. It was tore up. That most of the focus in my eyes and many people of the federal government was on the infrastructure, repairing the roads, the bridges, the ports, and not enough attention was being placed on bringing into full citizenship this massive population of people who had just been emancipated after this war. Black people, African Americans are now free. And so it was philanthropy that really picked up that charge and started saying, hey, look, you got to get these folks educated now. They've been denied education. We've got to get them so that they can, enter the full citizenry of the United States. And so it was actually George Peabody in 1867 put up the first $1 million. And the focus really was buying books, training teachers, and building schools. It was infrastructure, it was resources. Got to get books down to the South. Got to train people. We need an army of people that can teach this population. And then they need places, and so schools. So that was the main thrust, they're buying the books, training the teachers. So it's like it was huge workforce development undertaking, training all these teachers. And then third, building schools. Well, several prominent funds came out of that. The Peabody Fund, George Peabody, considered one of the wealthiest men in the nation at the time, put up the first $1 million for this. Then John Slater out of Connecticut did the same thing, hired a former president, Rutherford B. Hayes, to run it. This was probably in 1880, somewhere around there. The second one, he pretty much doing the same thing George Peabody did. Then Anna Jeanes, considered one of the wealthiest women in the nation at the time. She was Quaker out of Philadelphia. And there's a long history of the Quakers opposing slavery. helped support the Underground Railroad. And Anna Jeans, again, one of the wealthiest women in the nation and a Quaker woman, put up $1 million to create the Negro Rural South Education Fund somewhere around 1890s, somewhere late mid to 1890s. And her focus was on this army of teachers, Black women teachers, called the Jeans teachers. And then the Jeans supervisors, somebody to supervise all these schools that were popping up all over the place. The fourth major fund was obviously the Julius Rosenwald Fund. I mean, it's very well known, featured in the Smithsonian's African American Museum in Washington, D.C. Julius Rosenwald, extremely wealthy man who put Sears and Roebuck on the world map, worked with Booker T. Washington, who had been enslaved, and created Tuskegee University to develop a policy. And his policy was like Foundations Today, immense amount of seed money to build school buildings called the Rosenwald Schools. Well, all of those funds were consolidated except for the Rosenwald Fund somewhere around 1934 into what is now the Southern Education Foundation. And obviously, we're not building schools and buying books and training teachers anymore. But so much of the work in the early days during Reconstruction was sustaining that work through the development of public funds to pay for it. And so it was African Americans who were elected to office during Reconstruction, supported by philanthropists in New York and Boston and Philadelphia and places, who were drafting legislation and taking it to the state houses of Alabama and Mississippi and the Carolinas and Maryland, and passing into law that taxes would be raised not just to pay for roads and bridges, but to pay for public education. And when the troops pulled out of the South, Kristen, it was the landowners who wanted to kill the taxation, but it was actually poor whites who rose up and said, "Hey, look, let's keep let's keep this, because now our children can get educated, but let's just keep it separate." And so that began the fight to try to philanthropy. The Peabody Fund, the Slater Fund, the Jeans Fund, the Rosenwald Fund constantly fought against that segregation, and they were successful for many decades in holding it down. But over time, it just got overwhelmed. And when that happened, that's when I believe the Southern Education Foundation started getting into work with Thurgood Marshall and Jack Greenberg and folks like that on the issues of policy and research on the effects of segregating, how we educate our children. So that's how we got into the world of research and policy. We've had this iconic endeavor in leadership development that goes again back 100 and probably 50 years. As philanthropy was building the schools and buying the books and training the teachers early on. They took on the task of developing leaders, people who can run these schools, and assign the teachers. And so that's how we got into leadership development. That was early on also. So, and then workforce development was another one. I think definitely during Reconstruction. I think the Slater grant had in it industrial training. Today you would call that workforce development. So the Southern Education Foundation, our reach goes from kindergarten, pre-K to higher education, but we also have a strong school to work a component of our DNA, knowing that everyone's not going to go or needs to go to four-year college. And so that's people say you've done a lot. Well, we've had to, because for so long we were it. I mean, we predate the NAACP and the Legal Defense Fund, the Urban League by 40, 50 years. So we had to be involved in so many of these things. And most of HBCUs today in existence today, historically Black colleges, came out of that movement after Reconstruction. I mean, during Reconstruction. So that's our history, Kristen. I hope I didn't make it too long.
Nope, that was perfect. And actually, you gave us some very natural lead-ins so we can talk about some of your focus areas. So that was perfect. I'm going to attempt to provide some statistics, but correct me if I go astray. So my understanding is from my research that 9 out of 10 students, so 90% of students in the United States, are served by public schools.
Yeah.
Am I good so far? Okay. And then for the southern states, and I think it was 11, I'm trying to remember from your website, I think 11 out of 15 states invest less than $10,000 per student in the public education system. Okay. Correct. And how does the poverty level in the southern states factor into this as well? Because I remember there being a statistic, and I want to say it was a very significant number. I want to say 85% of the counties whose residents live in persistent poverty are in the South. And so I'm curious as to how that impacts this conversation.
Has a huge impact, Kristen. You just follow the numbers. I mean, it's almost predictable, and it should not be predictable that income level determines education. But it does in the United States. It does. Zip codes, where students live, where people live, their zip code. You can determine the graduation rates, from that community or from that zip code, or the college matriculation rates. That's wrong. There are a number of nations, nowhere near as far advanced as we are, that have public support, publicly funded education, and you don't see those types of disparities based on income. It's just unnecessary for the United States to have this, and it's just a persistent foil for us. That has to be addressed. And I personally believe that it can be addressed. But yes, socioeconomic status, poverty levels have a huge, and I've seen huge impact on education attainment levels.
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the things you were just describing feels to me, and this gets into the systemic part of this conversation, of potentially a byproduct of how we have set up our levels of governance in the United States. So we have obviously local level, we've got state level, we've got federal level, and obviously there are levels in between those as well if you loop in counties and other regions. And so I'm curious as to one of the key issue areas that SEF focuses on is governance. And that sort of those closest to the taxpayers and to the parents should really be the ones driving this. So why is that the right level?
I'm glad you asked that, Kristen, because that's one of mine. When I became president of the Southern Education Foundation in a few years ago, 2018, I really pulled that one up to the front lines, the governance, how we are governing our systems of education. And I've been around for a while in this task, this undertaking of how can we create better opportunities and how can we improve public education. But there's an undeniable element in public education, and that is governance, how we are governing our public schools. And unfortunately, a large number of our governance models, school boards, for example, have had decades of disruption. I say probably 40, 50 years now of disruption that have negatively impacted leadership. School district superintendent, the super has negatively impacted leadership and the ability for systems, in this case, the school systems, to have consistent and sustained improvement following any particular strategy. It seems like strategy are constantly changing because governance is constantly changing, and it's just too disruptive. And I just think there've got to be better models out there that will allow for local governance, local input, because I don't see changing that. Public education has always been local. You raise the money in your local community to pay for your schools. States have gotten into it to bring about some equity and fairness and all that, and some supervision. And the federal government puts a small percentage of funds into public education, which is a good thing, which is how the federal courts and Brown v. Board of Education are able to get involved. But for the most part, it is a local matter. And how communities want to envision their children in their community getting their reading, writing, and arithmetic, and so much more, how they see that going on, being carried out is critical. And so informing the population, informing parent groups, informing community groups for more serious engagement in the governance. And governance, it takes on some complicated and multifaceted issues. So how do we put in place the types of governance structures and leadership models can allow systems of education to breathe, quality, good air, and become the best systems at educating our children as possible.
And part of this to me sounds as if we need to go back to the funding conversation as well. So if, as you said, the education level that you typically receive, and obviously the resulting results from that was very inelegantly said, but comes from sort of the income level of the people in the community. How do we reconcile the needs with income level? And then how do we factor in this local governance if that is the ideal structure for that?
Well, that's where I think the states can play a good role, an important role, because it is states, state departments of education that have, I hate to use this term, but I'll use it, equity vehicles to compensate for those disparities. So you've got Jones County on this side of the railroad tracks and Smith County on this side of the railroad tracks. Jones County has always had all the money. The houses are worth far more. Go across railroad tracks, Smith County, same state, within 5 miles of one another. Smith County, they are the descendants of the people who worked the land, for the Jones County people. And so when property taxes are taken, collected, Jones County has $1 million, and Smith County has 100,000 to educate their children with. And so the states looked at it and say, okay, to bring some level, there's a term of nuance for this. States will appropriate certain funds to Smith County to try to compensate for that. That's a good start, but but unfortunately, are not sufficient to deal with those deficiencies and those inequities. And that's actually those funding models, I believe, in fact, we are, need to be more thoroughly examined, and our tax laws revisited to determine how best to raise the funds to educate our young people. I mean, this is critical work here. I mean, you got to have an educated population, and we can't waste anyone. So let's figure out ways as to how our taxing authorities and our revenue authorities can compensate or accommodate for those disparities. That's just one. Federal government gets involved in that also to help equal that that playing field, not by taking resources from over here, but raising everyone up to an appropriate and effective level. And going back to the equity piece, it might be that Smith County actually needs more money because of all those deficiencies. And that's when you really talk about equitable education.
And that was actually going to be my follow-up question, because I was wondering if at this point, given how long these systems have been in place, and I'm going to attempt to use these words correctly. So is it an equal distribution, which might mean redistributing some money from a wealthier county to a less well-off county, sufficient at this point? Or is what is more necessary is some larger influx of resources and support for those counties or those school districts that have historically been underserved?
Well, let me move to the latter part of what you said, but preface it by saying this, and that is, yes, identifying what those deficiencies are. Because it's not just money. It's okay. What are the deficiencies? The students in Smith County over here with the lower tax bracket, they may need after-school services, after-school services that the school kids over in Jones County don't need. Mm-hmm. The kids over in Smith County might need at least 2 or 3 times a week a health service professional to come in and take a look at these kids, from time to time. So mom and daddy over in Smith County sometimes just don't have, the resources and the blessings, to be able to keep their children, vaccinated and up to date, and so that they can learn, so that their health issues are not an issue. We know free or reduced lunch and breakfast programs, and we could just know what the impact that has had on education. I think some of those need to be revisited to make sure that they're not, that they are in concert with the home, with the family. But at the same time, your Jones County kids may be able to get up and go straight to school with a full stomach, and the kids in Smith County, come to school with their stomachs growling and therefore unable to pay full attention to what the instructor is trying to get. So those are some what we sometimes call wraparound services in community schooling that can be identified and brought to bear for Smith County.
That makes sense. And one of the key issue areas that I think SEF focuses on is sort of that, I guess I would call it a holistic approach to students' education. It's not just the school, what's happening in the school itself in terms of education. It's, what is the access, what is the support that's around that? Are the schools safe? And then the curriculum as well.
Yes, I agree. So to ask that question again, Kristen.
So it's, I think for a lot of our audience, that sort of holistic approach is perhaps something also new that they're sort of coming to understand, that it's more than just how many teachers are in the school and how many students does each teacher have.
Precisely. The holistic approach, looking at the whole child, and all the variables that go into this. In fact, in my day, that wasn't done. I'm not saying that it shouldn't have been, but there's just too much research out here right now that shows that it's not just the brick and mortars and making sure the child has an ability to get to a library. There are so many other variables that can negatively or positively impact a child's ability to learn and therefore compete like everyone else. And so we have to look at the holistic approach when we take a look at how to address some of these inequities.
Makes sense. I also am curious how school vouchers plays into this conversation. And so it appears, again, from a layperson's standpoint, that one of the, and I'll air quote, solutions to deteriorating public education was to enable students from under-resourced or less well-served areas the option to go to a private school if there was one in the area, and that would be publicly funded through vouchers. So I would love to get your opinion on how vouchers play into this, and how, is that the right focus? And or should it be, no, we just need to make the public education system better?
Well, I never would want to confuse vouchers with other so-called school reform models, particularly charter schools, because charter schools are public schools. But let's stick with vouchers, just specifically what you're talking about. And I'll just say emphatically that I and the Southern Education Foundation, we are unequivocally opposed to vouchers, the taking of public funds to pay for private education at the massive levels we see now. Sure, there's a history of, and courts have supported a use of private funds to assist students in being transported to the Catholic school where they're going. Things like that are reasonable. But when you're talking about vouchers to attend a private school, here's why that's problematic, Kristen. One, what research we've seen out there that has been going on for a couple of decades now doesn't show any significant improvement in the education attainment levels of students with these vouchers. And actually, we see some reversals there. We also see many parents not being able to sustain their children's attendance at these schools because the vouchers just won't, cover the entire tuition. A $2,000 or $3,000 voucher for $10,000, $15,000 private school, or you can find yourself getting in debt like that, and a lot of parents have. But our fundamental primary concern with that is that vouchers, the siphoning off of public funds, has always come hand in hand and been associated with and found itself around those who sought to maintain segregation. It is always. The majority of the private schools in the South were created right after Brown v. Board of Education was decided, or right around that time. White communities simply said, look, we are not going to send our children to school, with Black children. So therefore, we'll create schools. And so a lot of these schools, many of them religious schools, which is very interesting because I have a degree in divinity and I actually teach political theology. I will be teaching political theology this fall. And I just think that's very interesting that church, in many respects, the Christian church was heavily involved in the creation of schools, private schools after Brown versus Board of Education, to thwart desegregation. That's another one I've got to get into
Yeah,
one
it's an
day.
interesting thing to wrap your mind around. Yes.
Yeah, to wrap my mind around that, the church's involvement in that. And so a lot of those schools that were created, I mean, these are hundreds around the country were created right around in the 50s and early 60s, have found themselves in financial straits in recent years and in recent decades. And the enrollment is down. Nobody can afford that. So where do you get the money? The public schools. And so let's push vouchers. So there are agendas here also. And so then to put a Black face on this and say, okay, well, this is a way to help the young, impoverished African-American child in the inner city of Detroit or Cleveland or somewhere, by having a voucher to go out there. I think that's somewhat of that's not telling the full story. Look, I would never try to tell anyone, look, get in someone's way of an option to help their child, if they know they can find a better school. But I would have to get into and it's a tough conversation, and it's just a tough conversation. But it has always been this way. If you want a private education, pay for it. If you want a public education, pay your taxes like everyone else and send your child to the public school. And you could have some choices in that. This magnet school over here, if your child gonna get into this specialty school in the public system. But let's not drain the public funds to prop up private education in ways that will only exacerbate segregation, racial identifiability, and actually don't seem to have any proven results. And now, at the same time, no one is saying, and I'm not saying, that our public schools are perfect. They need a lot of improvement. But I don't think the way to improve our public schools is by taking those funds from them and sending them to private schools under some false assumption that this how is going to create competition and make the public schools do better. That's not going to happen.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, and if for some of those southern states, we talked about that figure that they're investing less than $10,000 per student. And I want to say the national average is a little over 12,000, if I remember
Yes,
correctly.
precisely.
Is 12,000 even sufficient? I mean, is there an ideal? Has your research, I don't know if your research has looked into this, but is there research that shows sort of what is the ideal amount that should be invested in a student?
Kristen, I have seen that. I've seen that. We haven't done that research, but I've seen that somewhere. I'm glad you asked that. I'm going to look for that because that's. I've seen that, but I don't recall those numbers.
Got it.
But I do recall strong suggestions that it be increased.
Okay. All right. That's helpful to know. Okay. I also want to talk a little bit about some of the specific programs that SCF oversees or runs with regard to really just making everything better. So the first is the Equity-Centered School Governance Program. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that advocacy network and what's being done through that program.
That program goes back again, well over 100 years, and has its roots in early efforts between philanthropy in the North working with African American communities in the South after the Civil War. And this is all rural. In fact, the Jeans Fund that I mentioned that came out of Philadelphia, Anna Jeans, the Quaker family, it originally was called the Negro Rural South Education Fund. A major way, the major strategy to work with communities, Black communities in the South, was to form them together and visit with them, and provide information on how schools are working elsewhere, particularly in the North. These are how the schools are working in the North. These are the funds you have. Here are some of the private funds. We might be able to get some public funds. It was working with the communities. Oftentimes, obviously, no surprise, The Black church was involved with that also. The women's groups dominated that. The Black women groups, going to get anything done. They were, dominating, that world, the genes teachers. So it was really building communities of interest and practice together, who had a stake in this. And so the model that we're talking about now is replicating that. We've done it here recently. I think we had when I arrived, we had a grant from the Gates Foundation to build something called the Southern Policy and Practice Network, which feeds upon this historic role that the Southern Education Foundation has played in educating communities on education policy and education resources, and then strengthening their ability to advocate on behalf of themselves and their communities, and connecting them with real policymakers, most of the time state elected officials. So that's good work. We really like that work, Chris, and actually something that we're looking to expand. I think you gotta get the people on the ground connected and involved in the work to improve their communities.
Is that something you've noticed? Because the Southern Policy and Practice Network, when I was doing my research, was also something that intrigued me. Is that network or are you finding it harder to find those people in the local communities to get involved? I'm just wondering, sort of like, is there a level of, citizen support that used to exist that no longer exists? And that's something also from a foundational perspective needs to be worked on.
It does need to be worked on. But I'll tell you, Kristen, I'm actually impressed with the fervor, the community fervor for involvement. What hurts is that it's just a lack of information. And that's a role we step into play during our research. It's just a lack of information. These are good people, hardworking people. I went to a session in Little Rock, Arkansas. The Winthrop Rockefeller Foundation was sponsoring this one, and I was asked to come speak because this is something we do. And it was in an evening around 6 or 7 o'clock. It was the meeting was about a particular school and some accountability measures they were going through and what parents should know about that, what resources were available. Everything was going on. The place, it was in the basement of a 4-H club, one of the 4-H club, a 4-H club in Little Rock, Arkansas. It was in the basement. The place was packed. Probably 70% mothers, many of whom had babies in baby carriages, 2 or 3 kids running around them, paying attention to what the person on the stage is trying to say. And we provided a meal, true, they were eating. And just the interest, the questions they were asking. And I just said to myself, if anybody says that, communities of color or, disadvantaged communities or these communities like this are not interested in the education of their children, they should see this. They want the best for their children. They just need help in figuring out how to navigate the bureaucracies of the school systems that their children attend. And so I think the fervor is there. What I think is lacking, Kristen, and this is the gap that we try to fill, is getting them that data, that information, so they can expand and advance their thinking and their questions and thus their involvement and impact on the education of their community.
That makes perfect sense to me. And I think the last of the specific programs I really wanted to talk about, and you addressed this a little bit when we were talking at the beginning of our time together, is that leadership development piece. And so there are a couple of programs that SEF oversees that are really working on developing the next generation of leaders. And so I would love for you to talk a little bit about those.
Yes, again, that's historical also, nothing that started under my time. And that goes back, again, late 1800s. Probably even before that, probably around the 1880s. And as I mentioned, there was a massive philanthropic effort here in the United States to educate the population in the South. In fact, one of them, the Slater Fund, was for the newly emancipated population and poor whites. That's actually one of our charters. His deed to us is and poor whites. So there was no system of education for anybody. of any substance in the South, south of the Mason-Dixon line. All that was up north with the Horace Mann movement, if you remember that history, to create universal education, or what is now called public education. But the work, philanthropy's involvement early on in building these schools and buying these books, that quickly learned that, look, we need people to manage this, to order the books and assign the teachers and so leaders. And so we got into that early on. So it continues today in two principal forms that we're actually looking to expand. One is the oldest, which today is called SELI, Southern Education Leadership Initiative. And it's had that name because of some significant funding that came in for the last 25 years, 25 years. So SELI, Southern Education Leadership Initiative, which is something we've been doing for a long time, but now it is bringing young men and women who are in college or maybe the first year of graduate school into a cohort of fellows program. It's a fellowship. And they receive training, intense training from Southern Education Foundation, exposure to leaders in education, from leaders of presidents of universities, chairmen of school boards, head of the Department of Education for states, or foundation executives to come and speak to these students and work with them about the issues in education and the various entities that seek to impact that positively. And then we also place them in internships around the region, from Mississippi to Maryland, all over, in these president's offices, or at the school board, or at the foundation, or at the museum, or a lot of nonprofits that work in communities to empower parents. So we have a long, deep network in those organizations that we call sites, internship sites. We have a long history of that. And so that's the SELI program. The RELLN program, Racial Equity Leadership Network, is also connected to our past. I mentioned the Gene supervisors that came out of the Genes Fund, which was consolidated into the Southern Education Foundation in 1934, I think. But the Gene supervisor, today we call it the RELLN, Racial Equity Leadership Network. And the Racial Equity Leadership Network is, again, a cohort of probably 18 school district superintendents from around the country, primarily the South, who we bring together for intense training in identifying inequities and what levers you can pull as touch points to dissipate or address these inequities before they become baked in and really begin to negatively impact children. That's a very popular program, Kristen. I really like that one, because school district superintendents, they're on a treadmill from the day they arrive at the office to the time they go home. And they don't really have time to get amongst some of their fellow school district superintendents and talk about some of the issues that are going on that in the education of their children they just can't get to, because they got to take care of the budget, the faculty, the teachers union, the politics. And so getting them away, which we do, amongst their peers, facilitated by researchers and scholars who can really identify these nuances and have these superintendents who are running these systems talk about it. It's exceptionally valuable. Exceptionally valuable. So those are the two we have right now. We're looking to actually expand into some other areas of leadership development, but more in public service.
Okay, no, that makes sense. All right. Before we get to our lightning round questions, there are a couple questions I like to ask each of our guests. And one of them is, what do you wish people were paying more attention to in this area?
I wish people were paying more attention to the children and to the big picture in terms of this country, and how important quality education has been to the development of community development, people, and the development of this country. It's indispensable what public education, or in the past called universal education or mass education, basically tax-funded education. It's incalculable what it has done for this country. But in recent decades, it has been just inundated by so many political disruptions, many of them well-intended. I would wish for people to get back on the main issue of getting our children educated to the best possibility of really having a fulfilling life. And so sometimes when we get caught up in vouchers and tax credits and charter schools and teacher strikes and things of that nature, we forget about that. But I just think if we focused on, on the children and strengthening their abilities to become educated, that we can then have some thoughtful conversations with some real tough questions.
All right, that makes sense. And then what do you see as the biggest priorities to help close some of these education equity gaps or to advance education justice?
One, researched and thorough and sincere recognition of inequity, that it exists. I mean, you can't solve a problem if you don't admit you have one. And so just if we could just quit dancing around these issues, particularly a lot of issues of race, it just be real and say, okay, yeah, there are some inequity and it isn't fair. Then how can we as a community, as a people, as a country, particularly in education, how can we address that to give children a fair and equitable shot at getting a quality education so they can be all they can be and be productive citizens, which is what we all want. So just a recognition of those inequities, that's a major piece. And then at the same time, understanding that we cannot continue to dance around and away from some of these archaic and out-of-date funding formulas on how we're funding our education. We've got to come to grips with that. It's got to be a recognition. I don't see enough, I haven't seen enough research on that making its way seriously into policy considerations in any state in the country. I haven't seen it. And that's one I just think needs to be pushed along.
Is there, with regard to the funding models, is there a particular model that you are hoping sort of comes to the fore in that, or is this really, the research on this is new enough, or there are many models that would work, it's just we know the current one isn't exactly it?
I'm beginning to see some models emerge that of which I have a preference, Kristen. And I've been in this a long time, in and out, but I've been in it a long time. And I mean, there's the pool concept, which is in place in a lot of places. Just have a pool of funds and find out which each school needs, and let's finance them accordingly. Well, there are a lot. That's easier said than done. There are a lot of other things that need to be in place for that. But that's one model that it's becoming to me becoming more and more attractive. And I'll say that within the context of community models. I'm becoming increasingly interested and supportive of, and the Southern Education Foundation, of community models of education. We have put out many reports on community schools. They've gotten a lot of publicity in recent years. I think the great basketball player LeBron James helped put one together in his hometown of Akron. That's a public school, that the I Promise school that he initiated up there in Akron, Ohio. It's not a voucher. That's not a charter school. That is a public school, but it is a community school. Identify the needs of the students and get the services in it. NEA is looking at that also. NEA Foundation is looking more seriously at that. So that's so what I said earlier within the context of community schools is a funding model that is becoming increasingly attractive.
Okay, perfect. All right, Raymond, now it's one of my favorite parts of each of these conversations, which I've dubbed the lightning round. What progress do you hope to see in the next year with regard to equity gaps or education justice?
I like to see some finality on the digital divide. It's just find out what's needed and appropriate the funds and just get it done.
Okay.
Because so much learning is going to be online now. We cannot have this problem with the digital divide. I want to see that done this next year.
Okay. That's an ambitious goal. I like that one. Okay. What gives you hope that progress will be made?
I think a lot of Americans were shook by this pandemic and having their children at home during this time and trying to figure out how to get this done. And they know from the wealthiest to the least that the infrastructure is just not there. So I have a lot of hope that the people at home, the parents, and particularly working families, are going to be very supportive of any type of policies, because it's going to cost money to address the digital divide. I got a lot of hope in that.
Perfect. All right. Who else is doing good work to make progress in this area?
Oh, well, I hate giving out shout outs because you always miss somebody, right?
No one will hold you strictly accountable to exactly what you're doing. You can always email me later too if you want to add people.
Well, I definitely like the work that the Education Law Center, David Sierra and his group, and the Southern Poverty Law Center, Margaret Wong's group, are doing, particularly with their venture in public funds for public schools. And we've been supportive of that. We've been active with that. We've filed several amicus briefs in concert with them. I also say the NAACP Legal Defense Fund and Education Fund, Sherilyn Eiffel. She's got her hands full with voting rights and other issues in home and housing. But I'm glad to see that the NAACP Legal Defense Fund is still staying involved with the on the litigation side of public education. It's unfortunate you got to get into litigation sometime, but I'm glad to see they're doing good work there. NEA, my friend Sarah Sneed, and the things she's advancing at the National Education Association Foundation on particularly in community schools. That's really powerful work she's talking about doing there. Of course, Linda Darling Hammond at the Learning Policy Institute, just her thought leadership alone and the research that LPI has been pushing on improving public education. So you got a lot of good groups out there. Fortunately, we work together. I can't forget, some of these foundations that are out here that are also supporting us in this. We get a lot of conversations with a number of foundations who want to support us in this role.
That's great. David was actually our guest earlier in June for the first discussion we had.
Oh, wow. Yeah, he's a lawyer.
Yep, we have an affinity there. So yes, we always like to have that foundational conversation. All right, and the final lightning round question is, for our audience, who should they be reading or listening to or using as a thinkers? Like, are there podcasts or books or articles that you would recommend for us?
I know he does a lot of them. Rucker Johnson. I would definitely suggest Rucker Johnson out of Berkeley, UC Berkeley. Definitely give Rucker a shout out in that arena. Matt Shaw at Vanderbilt. The gentleman at Brookings, Andre Perry, definitely at Brookings. I mean, he's putting out some good writing on this. Iris, she's at George GW School of Education. Iris Rothberg, definitely Iris. I would read Iris. And again, a lot of the work that's coming out of the Learning Policy Institute also. But I would also suggest people read some of the work coming out of the Southern Education Foundation.
Your reports are very interesting. I have spent a lot of time on your website over the last few weeks. So,
well, thank you, Kristen. Been trying to work on that website constantly and make it more friendly.
I understand how that goes. I have a consistent struggle with our website as well. All right, so I'd like to thank our audience for joining us for tea today. Please join us in 2 weeks for our next tea. In July, we'll be looking at the courts and the judicial system, since July 11th is the official 80th anniversary of Justice Jackson's appointment to the U.S. Supreme Court. So July will be dedicated to the courts, and look forward to seeing you all then. And Raymond, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your thoughts with us. Thank you for joining us for Tea Time with the Jackson Center today. We always appreciate your thoughts and comments. A couple of upcoming program notes. As we mentioned, this evening is the Osprey and the Law program in conjunction with the Roger Tory Peterson Institute. If you are here in Jamestown, please join us live at 7 p.m. at the Institute. And if you are elsewhere in the world, please join us virtually. You can still register for that program at the Jackson Center's website, roberthjackson.org. In July, the Tea Time series will be focused on the court and the judicial system. So our next tea on Thursday, July 8th, we will have as our guest the Center for Court Innovation. Also later in July, on Thursday, July 22nd, in lieu of tea, will be the Robert H. Jackson Supreme Court Lecture at Chautauqua Institution. Our guest for that will be Professor Melissa Murray, a professor of law at NYU Law School, and also one of the voices behind the Strict Scrutiny podcast. And then on Monday, July 26th, Brian Garner will be joining us for a discussion of the prose of Robert H. Jackson, specifically focused on his closing statement at the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg. July 26th is the 75th anniversary of the closing statement itself, and we look forward to hearing Brian's thoughts and having that conversation with him. And we look forward to you joining us for all of our programs in July. Thank you.